Good evening and welcome everybody. It's great to see such a full lecture theatre for this inaugural lecture. Inaugurals are always very special events, and for me it's a particular pleasure tonight to host this one by Professor Fiona Mackay. Fiona's an old friend, an outstanding colleague, and a political scientist of distinction. And her inaugural will be on the theme of nested newness and the gendered limits of institutional change. As many of you will know, Fiona was born and brought up in the northeast of England to an expat Scottish father and a Yorkshire mother. She has an undergraduate degree in politics and modern history from Manchester University and a PhD in politics from this university, winning major prizes for each degree. She hadn't taken an orthodox route into academia. She was a croupier in a casino for a while. She gave that a spin. Then she served her apprenticeship as a trainee reporter with Thompson Regional Newspapers in Newcastle, and she joined Granada TV in its award-winning news operation. There's a theme here about awards, in Manchester and Liverpool. After almost a decade as a print and broadcast media journalist, and by then with baby daughter Georgina, she took herself off to Manchester University. After graduating, she returned to media work temporarily, and I'm told, as a researcher on a series of cheesy historic crime drama documentaries with the veteran actor Edward Woodward, probably winning some awards, no doubt. But by then she'd decided to give academia a go, so she moved to Edinburgh with Georgina, by now about to start primary school, and began a part-time PhD in the politics department. After a bumpy start, she had the good fortune to be matched with Alice Brown and Lindsay Patterson as her supervisors, and things picked up from there. And then she never left Edinburgh. She got the PhD in 1996. She became research fellow on an ESRC-funded project thereafter, and then a lectureship in 1997, a senior lectureship 2003, the appointment to a personal chair in politics in 2012, having by that time served as director of the graduate school in the School of Social and Political Science, the school she now heads with distinction. Along the way, she's proud to have mentored many talented junior colleagues. She's passionate about teaching and supervision, and particularly her work with PhD students, and she's pleased that so many of her PhD students, past and present, are here this evening. Fiona's research and teaching interests are in the field of gender and politics, with a focus since the late 1990s on the way in which political institutions can be designed or reformed to address gender inequality and promote gender justice and women's human rights. Her intellectual agenda is one which combines insights from gendered analysis and institutionalist theory to understand and explain the dynamics of gendered power inequalities in public and political life. I got to know Fiona about 15 years ago when she proposed and then led the research project Gender and Constitutional Change in the then ESRC Devolution and Constitutional Change programme. That was one of a series of distinctions which established her as one of the leading scholars in the world in her field. Currently she's part of a multi-institution team on a European Research Council funded programme, Understanding Institutional Change, a Gender Perspective, directed by Georgina Whalen at Manchester. And she's also mapping the creation and early years of the United Nations new entity for gender equality, UN Women, with support by the British Academy. She founded, with Mona Crook, and co-directs with Louise Chappell, Meryl Kenny and Georgina Whalen, the Feminism and Institutionalism International Network, which promotes dialogue and interchange between feminist scholars and the mainstream. She's a great collaborator, both with fellow academics but also with policy practitioners. She's recently co-organised a series of events with the Scottish Trade Union Congresses and Henderson, civil society organisations and academics called Constitutional Futures to inform public debate in the run-up to the referendum in Scotland later this year. She's a long-time member of the Scottish Feminist Organisation in Gender and co-edited the Gender Audit with Esther Breitenbach, Louise Tate and others. Following Alice Brown's example as an activist academic or an academic activist, she was involved in 50-50 campaigns in the run-up to devolution in the 1990s and was a co-author of the research advice that informed the Scottish Government's first equality strategy. She has been busy. I'm delighted this evening to welcome Fiona's daughter Georgina and partner Georgie, also Fiona's friends and colleagues, old and new, especially those who've come a distance, including her first politics professor Malcolm Anderson and his wife Jacqueline, our current Fulbright Scotland visiting professor from the States, Karen Beckwith. She's sorry that others cannot be here. Johnny Lovendusky from Birkbeck, Louise Chappell from University of New South Wales, Elizabeth Meehan from Queen's University Belfast, and Jan Webb from here. She wants to acknowledge publicly their great influence on her thinking and their support and friendship over the years. Finally, she'd like us to remember two Scottish feminist public intellectuals, colleagues and friends whose absence is keenly felt tonight. The writer Susie Innes and the feminist economics professor Ailsa Mackay, whose premature deaths in 2005 and earlier this year have left us professionally and personally the poorer. Fiona, as personal chair in politics, the lectern is yours for your inaugural lecture on nested newness and the gendered limits of institutional change. Over to you.
Thank you, Charlie. Before I start, I think I'd just like to respond to how I feel looking around the room. It's fantastic to have so many friends, colleagues, people from different places, different times of my life gathered here together for one evening. So I'm really touched and humbled. Thank you for coming. All right, moving on. Okay. Preparing for this inaugural not only forces you to think about what you do, why you do it, how you might communicate that to a broad audience, and I'm told in 45 minutes, it also requires us as academics to make visible, I think to a far greater extent than is conventional, the ways in which who we are and what we do as academics is shaped by where we've come from, and the people, ideas, values and events which have influenced us along the way. These snippets of autobiography, I think, reveal how embedded we are. For feminists and other social constructivists, of course, we already know the theory, the personal is political and so on and so forth. But in practice, believe me, it doesn't stop you feeling a little bit vulnerable, a little bit daunted standing here. Now, you might be wondering, this was inspired by a piece by the Scottish artist Douglas Gordon, which is on display at the Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art, called A List of Names, 1990 to present. It's a random list, or his is a random list, of every person Gordon has ever met and can remember. And it's an exploration of and a reflection on memory. Now, mine is more discerning. It's those of you who I'd like to acknowledge and pay my dues. And I thought it would be a neat way to avoid the Oscar list. But like Gordon's work, it is somewhat random, it relies on memory and space, and there may be some embarrassing omissions. Anyway, like everybody else, I'm part of different sorts of families and communities. So families of the blood, the heart, the intellect. Edinburgh, the city and the university, and many of you in this lecture hall tonight are family in those senses. But I'd like first of all to pay tribute to the family I come from. So these are very old pictures of my mum Ruth, who's still going strong in her late 80s, and my dad Robert, who died in 1992, just after my big move to Edinburgh. Both come from long family traditions of religious nonconformism and hard work, sometimes hard scrabble. Quaker, Methodist, liberal no-nonsense farmers on the Yorkshire side, and Presbyterian, trade unionist and Fabian socialist on the Scots side. So not surprisingly, my family values included fairness, egalitarianism, service, not prejudging, making up your own mind, not taking yourself too seriously, a cardinal sin, and not letting anyone tell you that you can't do X or Y because you're a girl. So my mother, but particularly my father, made me a feminist. And to riff on that old joke, if you gave him the wool, he would make you one too. In fact, he could knit. He was a physicist of many talents. So moving on. Okay, by way of preamble, I'd like to start with a rather inconsequential biographical story. Picture, if you will, a slip of a lass, I know that's hard to imagine now, I grant you, not long into her apprenticeship as a cub reporter in the north of England. A bit wet behind the ears, a bit gobby, but keen. She's returning to the newsroom from an evening assignment. Now, by this time, the front door is long since locked, so she takes the time-honoured reporter's shortcut through the back door, up the stairs, and across the compositor's room. Okay, it's still the day, so this is where the latest edition is being typeset. It's still the days of hot metal, labour-intensive, skilled composing. A few paces in, and she notices the print workers have gone quiet. Then it starts. A clashing, clanging, jarring sound. The sound of arm's length metal compositors' trays being struck together. Clang, clang, clang. Not friendly. Cheeks burning, ears ringing literally, she runs the gauntlet to the relatively more amiable hubbub of the newsroom. The women in the newsroom, and it is the women, because the male reporters get free passage through this all-main domain, don't make too much of this unwelcome guard of honour. If they can't face the racket, they take a circuitous route through unlit corridors. It's an annoyance, it's a time waster, it's not a trauma. In fact, 35 years later, it did take a little while to dredge it. But what was it? It was male din. Male din as the reaction to an unwelcome incursion of women into male space. It was a salutary lesson for a young woman that whilst new formal rules might be in place that said I was equal, the Sex Discrimination Act had just been passed, it was that long ago, the Equal Pay Act had just come into force. But it reminded me that it was more complicated than that the informal rules said quite another thing. Mailed in with multiple roots and resonances, which I hope will provide some light on the main body of my talk. In lots of respects, the compositor's chorus of disapproval, if you wish, is little different from the mailed in and disquiet encountered in other institutional and organisational arenas. The presence of bodies out of place can disrupt and breach institutional and cultural norms and subsequently provoke seemingly extreme responses. Now, we don't need to look very far, a couple of 100 miles down the road, to the House of Commons, for example, to see how women and other newcomers, such as BME parliamentarians, are treated as space invaders. This is to use the nicely turned phrase coined by the social theorist Nirmal Pur. It's a place where men sometimes heckle women so loudly they drown them out, as part of the Yaboo politics of Westminster. And of course, there are other well-documented reactions to space invaders in other institutional arenas, for example, the military, that are more egregious, more harmful, sometimes lethal. In the virtual world, too, there's been increasing attention paid to the threats and abuse meted out to women who seek a public voice in the Twitterverse and the blogosphere. Classic scholar Mary Beard knows a thing or two about men seeking to silence women. As she notes rather matter-of-factly, I think, not an appearance or utterance in the media or social media goes by without a chorus of death threats on Twitter. In a recent lecture for the London Review of Books, she argues that this sort of abuse is more than mere misogyny, although of course it is that as well. The public silencing of women fits old patterns. So there's a long backstory to the early days of Western literary traditions. In Homer's Odyssey, when Telemachus, the young son of Penelope and Odysseus, tells his mother to shut up and go to her room. Speech will be the business of men, all men, and me most of all, for mine is the power in this household. There are two important things to note here. A, as Mary Beard says, that the word for speech used is muthos, which means authoritative public speech. As Beard remarks, not the kind of chatting, prattling or gossiping that women can do. And B, that the mark or ritual of becoming a man, an elite man in this instance, is claiming the right to public speech and silencing women. Beard argues, and I agree, that public speaking and oratory were not merely things that ancient women didn't do, they were the exclusive practices and skills that defined masculinity as a gender. And this making of gender, of masculinity as authority, and of the mastery of the public sphere, is a legacy which still shapes contemporary institutions in their formal, if not their, in their informal rather, if not their formal dimensions. This making of gender is relational. Masculinity as authoritative voice, as presence in and mastery of the public sphere, relies on the mastery, silencing, and exclusion of the other, femininity, in other words. This othering, through dichotomous pairing and hierarchical ordering, I am authoritative, masterful, the public realm and public speech is mine, I am masculinity, therefore you, as femininity, are less culturally valued, submissive, privatised, domesticated, silent. Of course, women have always broken the rules, spoken out, claimed space, but as aberrations, exceptions, and honorary men, and have sometimes paid a very high price because there are very high stakes. I want to move now. Believe me, the autobiographical stuff does end. But my second semi-autobiographical story with an institutional point also addresses the place of women in old institutions, the Academy, Edinburgh politics. So Edinburgh celebrated its 50th anniversary last year, and around the same time a study by researchers at Birmingham University was published. It ranked the subject area as 5th highest in the UK for female presence. Today, about 40% of the staff and 40% of the full professors in politics and IR are women, compared with UK averages of 30% and 15%, respectively. When I arrived at Edinburgh as a PhD student in the 1990s, Edinburgh politics was already had already a comparatively good female presence in a discipline that was and still is a laggard. Women in politics teaching and feminist scholarship were also both well established. The 1980s had seen the arrival of feminist research pioneers like Alice Brown, who set out the subfield of women in Scottish politics, and I've got to say did impact before impact was a twinkle in the ESRC's eyes. Pippa Norris, who went on to win the 2011 Johann Skeeter Prize, and with Johnny Lewandowski did seminal work on women and political recruitment. Mary Buckley, who was a leading expert on gender and Soviet and post-Soviet politics. The 1990s saw a steady growth in female staff, including the arrival of the feminist theorist Kim Hutchings and myself. And in the 2000s, the teaching staff was joined by former Edinburgh PhDs Claire Duncanson, and for too short a time, alas, before they flew away, Meryl Kenny and Rosalind Cavanagh. Now, NB, I'm concentrating on the women who do feminist scholarship and gender politics. There are very healthy numbers of women academics working in other fields too. Indeed, they far outweigh the number of gender scholars now. But I think it's worth remembering, as Charles Rabb does in the history of politics and IR for the anniversary year, that for its first 20 years, politics didn't have a single female lecturer, never mind a feminist. So what happened? How were female bodies and feminist scholarship normalised in the institution? How did female and feminist voices get to speak authoritatively in this old and masculinized space? Well, it didn't happen by accident, nor did it happen by slow evolution. It's the story of critical actors and of key moments of institutional reform. The critical actor in this regard is in the audience today, Professor Malcolm Anderson. The literature talks about people like Malcolm as institutional entrepreneurs. And as part of his efforts to reform and modernise politics, he recruited new actors, including female academics. He created new structures, including the Women's Advisor Post, which still exists to this day. And he encouraged new ideas, including new scholarship around feminism and gender. I think an example of this is that he, together with Mary Buckley, edited a collection in 1988 called Women, Equality and Europe, which was one of the first, if not the first, to set out that field. So, looking at Malcolm, had Malcolm arrived at Edinburgh with the purpose of feminising the academy? Probably not, and I see him vigorously shaking his head. Is Edinburgh a feminist nirvana? Well, I think that might be stretching the point a little. But the modernisation agenda can open up spaces and opportunities for gender reform as part of wider change processes. These in turn set up new, more progressive paths with legacies we can still discern, including, I would argue, the heterodoxy and methodological pluralism for which Edinburgh politics and IR is known. And I think that we have that legacy as much as the commendable female presence. However, we all know from institutional theory that institutions need active maintenance, or reforms can easily succumb to erosion and drift. So I'm delighted that under the leadership of Professor Ailsa Henderson, who's here somewhere, Politics and IR has decided to capitalise on this 30-year track record and has made gender politics a strategic priority for new investment and growth. So, as you may have gathered by now, I'm interested in institutions, I'm interested in gendered institutions, and I'm interested in gendered institutional change. And I'm going to talk tonight about the promise and limit of institutional change from a gender perspective. Whilst all institutional innovation is difficult, I want to ask, why do gender reforms appear so vulnerable to regress? I argue that the stickiness of old rules, formal and informal, about gender, and the nestedness of new institutions within the wider environment, including existing gender regimes and gender dynamics, provides a powerful explanation for why it's so hard to make gender reforms stick. Now, it's 30 years since March and Olsen set off the institutionalist turn in political science, with the rather simple statement that the organisation of political life makes a difference. It seems pretty common sense that institutions, the formal and informal rules of the game, matter in their own right. They structure political life and shape political outcomes. But it is still an important counter to approaches that see institutions as merely the sum of individual behaviour, or as an epiphenomenon, merely the product or vehicle of wider social structures. My colleagues and I, who are part of the collaborative project of feminist institutionalism, apply a gender lens to institutionalist approaches. We argue that institutions are not gender neutral. At one level, this is merely an empirical observation, that men, especially elite men, with intersecting privileges of race, class, geopolitical position and so on, continue to dominate institutions of authority worldwide, numerically and in terms of power. It's also an empirical observation that the products of public institutions, so for example of constitutional, legal and political variants, such as laws, policies, doctrines, frameworks, systems of value and reward, continue to affect the daily lives of women and men in different groups of women and men differently, oftentimes reproducing or exacerbating patterns of disadvantage and discrimination, even when formally espousing ideals of equality between women and men. Feminist approaches to institutionalism bring a number of insights. First, that gender relations and gender norms and their institutionalised forms in what Connell conceptualises as institutional gender regimes are part of the wider legacies and ongoing dynamics within which reform efforts are nested and with which they must contend. Second, gender relations and rules and norms of masculinity and femininity provide important mechanisms, although they're often submerged, barely visible, by which wider, particular arrangements and power asymmetries are naturalised and institutionalised on the one hand, or resisted and discarded on the other. And third, that changes to the structuring of gender relations at micro level or broader societal shifts may be important potential causes of broader institutional change. So understanding the gendered nature of institutions allows us to expose and explain why seemingly neutral rules can result in outcomes that profoundly disadvantage women and marginalised groups of men. And also the way that institutions as producers of gender reinforce the status quo. As V. Spike Peterson argues, gender does the political work of making the limited options and precarious lives of subordinated groups seem somehow inevitable rather than unconscionable. However, there's considerable feminist scepticism from sections of the global women's movement and from feminist academics about the point of focusing on institutions as sites of potential reform and positive change, about the extent to which global political institutions, like for example the ICC or the UN, or local institutions like councils, parliaments, governments, can work for women, or be agents of social change, or involved in the transformation of power inequalities. For them, institutions are just too entangled in interlocking structures of power and oppression on gender, race, class, neoliberalism, imperialism, heteronormativity, and so on. However, I align with reformists who argue that the role of authoritative institutions in setting the rules and norms, and as active players as well as arbiters in distributive and discursive contests, means that it is important to engage with them, and actually that you just cannot neglect them. And of course, this is the classic division of progressive movements too, between insiders and outsiders, reform versus revolution, and the connections between them. So I view institutions, those local and global institutions of authority and governance, as both a part of the problem and as also an important part of any project to promote change, to promote gender justice, women's human rights, and equitable public policy. And I'll just say now, I realise that these are all contested terms, but you'll just have to agree with me on that point. As Karen Beckwith notes, if institutions are gendered, they surely can be regendered, including in ways that disrupt current patterns of power and inequality. Actors, too, of course, are central to my work. Now, to be sure, actors are constrained by institutions and wider social structures, but they also exercise agency, and they can use institutions as resources for action. For my purposes, there are insiders, like politicians and bureaucrats, outsiders, particularly women's movements, but also other social forces, and then there are the outsiders within. These are the feminists and gender experts, the tempered radicals, to use Rosie Eben's phrase, who work with the grain of an institution, but with the goal of exploiting its contradictions, its soft spots, and spotting opportunities to progress the cause of change. Actors may be change agents, institutional entrepreneurs, or potential reactionaries and veto players. To discover who is and who is not a critical actor is an empirical question. I'm interested in the potential for innovation, reform, and purposive change. Once created, institutions, however understood, are seen as hard to change. Indeed, as Mahoney and Phelan observe, persistence of some kind is virtually built into the very definition of an institution. Now, we don't fully understand how institutional change happens, but it seems likely that as well as the dominant understandings of new institutions arising as a result of a sort of an external shock, which then shifts things to a new path through critical junctures and so on, we should also understand change as arising from internal processes through these kind of slower processes that might take place under the radar, through layering, conversion and drift. These models still retain the insight that decisions made early on in the life of an institution, have particular significance because of the openness or permissiveness of the opening stages in a sequence. And they acknowledge the power of path-shaping continuities and the ongoing importance of legacies. But they also emphasise the importance of the daily enactment of institutions and ongoing political contestation as key drivers of institutional change. Now, newness can mean many things. We've already touched upon newness as new actors in old institutions, and indeed much of my early work was concerned with the barriers facing women seeking political office and their experiences as outsiders within, in councils and parliaments, and particularly their reflections about care as both a cost but also as a potential political resource for rethinking, regendering, if you wish, political values. Karen Beckwith was one of the first feminist scholars explicitly to theorise the impact of new actors on old institutions. Taking the case of Blair's Babes, that substantial cohort of female Labour MPs who were returned in the 1997 general election, she argues that despite their numbers, their newness limited their potential effect. Mary Katzenstein's study of women in the church and the military, Sally Kenny's work on women in the judiciary, also demonstrate the difficulties of newcomers in old institutions and the potential for backlash. But they also, interestingly, alert us to the radical potential of just being there. The presence of women unsettles the historic and symbolic association of men and masculinity with the exercise of institutional power. And over time, their presence recognises and normalises women and femininity as being in authority and an authority, as having muthos, if you will. This symbolic, arguably transformative effect is, of course, a central plank of Anne Phillips' classic argument, The Politics of Presence, in support of gender quotas. Now, we have a wealth of case studies now about efforts to insert new actors, new rules, new ideas into old institutions. And that work's focused on three large institutional trends: the adoption of gender quotas, the creation of women's policy machinery, and gender mainstreaming. And this field of research is very rich, but it presents us with a puzzle. On the one hand, there's been a rapid proliferation of these sorts of mechanisms. For example, quotas of one form or another have now been adopted by more than 100 countries. But on the other hand, outcomes have been very variable, and there's been very limited success in practice. So if we know that it's difficult to reform an institution once it's created, then it stands to reason that opportunities for reform, including gender reform, are created by the chance to be in at the start of a new or substantially revised institution. And that's certainly the intuition that has animated the efforts of women movement activists and reform seekers. So in theory, feminist reformers may take advantage of the permissive stage of institutional creation. By successfully intervening to insert new actors, new values, new rules into new institutions, reformers may profoundly influence the future development of an institution by locking in elements of gender equality and gender justice for a change, setting up new, more progressive paths, thus counteracting historic gender bias and gendered power imbalances, promoting women's descriptive and substantive representation and women's human rights. Georgina Whalen points to an emerging trend to intervene in processes of constitutional and institutional engineering with the aim of embedding rights and freedoms. And her own work on democratic transitions provides an illuminating example of this. So we're having a situation where new global gender norms, the results in themselves of global activism, have driven efforts by, for example, the UN to promote gender equality and women's participation in the drafting of post-conflict settlements and the design of new constitutions. We have examples too, of course, from the industrialised world, including, of course, the UK. And opportunities have also been created at global level with reforms to systems of international law and international organisations. And there have been some notable successes, particularly on paper. Most post-conflict, post-transition constitutions contain important provisions with regard to equality and women's human rights. Many constitutionalise gender quotas. In the field of international law, the Rome Statute, which led to the creation of the International Criminal Court, includes a powerful gender mandate. It provides legal recognition of gender-based violence in conflicts such as rape, enforced pregnancy, sexual slavery as war crimes, as well as requiring fair representation of women as judges and the inclusion of gender expertise. However, in practice, again, outcomes are mixed. Constitutional protections may be trumped in practice by religious or customary law. Chappell's work on the ICC demonstrates that the old international criminal legal norms may trump new victim-centred provisions, and national sovereignty may dilute the impact of the gender mandate in domestic contexts. Why do gender reforms then appear so vulnerable to regress, even in the context of newness? In the next part of my talk, I'm going to sketch out the idea or metaphor of nested newness, and to examine through that the promise and limit of institutional change. I'm going to illustrate my argument by looking at the Scottish Parliament, which was created in 1999 and draws upon my work with others on gender and constitutional change, and also on a more recent project on the creation of the United Nations entity UN Women, sometimes dubbed the super agency for women, but we'll come on to that. By nested newness, I mean that no institution, however new or radically reformed, is a blank slate. That the capacity for new paths is profoundly shaped by their institutional environment, no matter how seemingly dramatic the rupture with the past. New institutions are informed inevitably by legacies of the past, material legacies and existing patterns of power distribution, but also by cognitive and normative legacies, habits of the heart, frames of mind. Institutions always have multiple designers, often with contradictory ideas and differing goals. Institutions are also shaped by the environment in which they are nested, so the other institutions which interlock and overlap, which complement or contradict, which trump or are trumped by them. Now, this is not a new insight, but it's often overlooked. New institutions are embedded or nested in time, in space, and in sequence. This influences their design and impacts upon their subsequent development and capacity. So in most cases then, institutional creation is better understood as a bounded innovation within an existing system. Nested newness is also gendered. Now, you'd expect me to say that, wouldn't you? New institutions are nested in a whole set of gendered institutions. These legacies and interactions may enable or may frustrate the creation of a new institution and their reform agendas. That's a matter for empirical investigation, but they will play a powerful role in its development and on the actors seeking to instantiate it. As institutionalist scholars Streak and Phelan observe, all institutions require active maintenance, and new institutions in particular require elaboration of their meaning in practice. The path along which an institution is worked out, in this sense, is shaped by exogenous circumstances as well as a myriad of strategic choices, deciding together which of the many possible meanings of a young institution are practically explored or foreclosed and left by the wayside. So nested newness is a way of alerting us to the complexities of creating new institutions for all institutional designers, but perhaps particularly so for feminist designers, for whom, if you like, their new seeks to challenge rather than conform with the wider status quo, a cuckoo in the nest, if you wish. It suggests that it's important to attend to the ways in which new gendered institutions are enacted and instantiated in that post-design phase by gendered actors, using formal and informal rules and norms, and thinking about how the new and the old play out and with what effect on gender reform agendas. So turning now to nested newness in the case of the Scottish Parliament, I want to tease out some of these ideas using this example. First, First, we can observe the important role of organised women, mostly feminists, seizing the opportunities presented by devolution, as a number of reform paths come together. And demands for political inclusion of women on equal terms, the 50-50 slogan, became a shorthand for the wider devolution project. Now, Tom Nairn, writing in 94 in The Scotsman, put it this way: it had become a missionary idea. It has become the small n nationalist banner, an emblem of the kind of country people want. So women, including feminist reformers, were critical actors as part of a broader winning coalition. Second, we can observe the important role of these critical actors, many sitting in the room today, in envisaging and designing the new institution, which had aspirations to deliver a new sort of politics. In many respects, the Scottish case presents a kind of best case scenario. However, A, the formal creation of a new institution is only the first step, and B, institutions, as we said before, are the creation of multiple designers, cross-cut, oft-times contradictory with one another, which leads to unintended consequences. Post-design, what follows is a longer period of transition marked by instability and uncertainty, whereby a blueprint is put into practice and institutionalised. So a rather cheesy way of trying to demonstrate this. So the new formal political institutions of the Scottish Parliament were nested in a number of other formal and informal institutional clusters, each one of which had a variable trajectory of reform, interconnecting actors and differing gender dimensions. So we see, for example, the coexistence of old and new electoral systems, the partially reformed institutions of political recruitment and party systems, a largely unreconstructed political media, complex ideas about political representation and legacies from ongoing continuities with the Home Civil Service and Westminster. And then we put all of that into a multi-level system of governance with overlapping and shared competencies and responsibilities. Okay, we'll go back to that. I want to turn next to focus on the big beast in terms of understanding nestedness as a combination of institutional legacies and ongoing interconnections, the so-called Westminster model. So the designers of the Scottish Parliament, including gender equity entrepreneurs, had self-conscious aspirations to create a new set of institutions that would depart from the standard Westminster model and that would promote a different political culture. For shorthand purposes, I'm going to posit that the Westminster parliamentary model is old politics and is one of hegemonic political masculinity. So crudely speaking, power, sovereignty, authority are all gendered masculine at that symbolic level, as well as usually at the level of presence. Johnny Lovendusky points out that the institutions and practices of the Westminster model centre around zero-sum games, from the winner-takes-all electoral system to notions of indivisible parliamentary sovereignty, executive dominance of the legislature, to the gladiatorial and competitive political culture of hostile strangers. These institutional arrangements privilege rhetoric, speechifying, posturing and arcane practice, says Lovendusky, over cooperation, consensus-seeking and real discussion of alternatives. Indeed, I don't know if people saw earlier this month, we had yet another female MP announcing that she was quitting politics, fed up with the testosterone-soaked posturing and playground-style name-calling. And also we saw, I think just last week, Liberal Democrat Minister for Women Jenny Wilmot declaring that she hates Prime Minister's Question Time with a total passion and that she criticised the massively male environment of Westminster. The new politics of the Holyrood model, then, relate to new institutions, new processes and new political culture. So the founding documents of devolution set out four main aspirations: a new institutional balance, a parliament that looks like everyday life, not least in its social composition, the displacement of adversarial politics by a new, more collaborative way of doing business, and a step change in popular participation by citizens outside the Parliament. So these can be summed up in the four key principles of the Parliament, which were access and participation, equal opportunities, accountability and power sharing. So each of these principles could be seen to present a challenge to politics as usual and traditional command and control models. They can also be seen, I think, as a challenge to prevailing gendered models of politics. At the symbolic level then, new politics destabilises hegemonic political models. It doesn't privilege zero-sum games, it's more inclusive in its promotion of other-oriented political norms and practices. It's less bounded than Westminster, less hung up on the idea of sovereignty, of control, which feminist scholars argue are tightly coupled with hegemonic masculinities. Furthermore, as we know, it recognises the caring responsibilities of MPs and citizens, both symbolically and practically. For example, through the observation of family-friendly hours, sitting times confined to school term times, and the provision of a visitor's creche. The commitment to gender mainstreaming and subsequently gender-responsive budgeting questions the presumed gender neutrality of political and policy institutions and challenges the way in which these institutions reproduce and contribute to gender inequality via assumptions and taken for granted values and everyday working practices which shape policy processes and priorities. So how do actors enact new institutions? No institutional blueprint is complete. So for a start, there are always ambiguities for different groups of actors to contest, to elaborate, to exploit. So in terms of the new Scottish Parliament, it had comparatively high levels of female representation. So 37% in 99, and at that it stood at almost double the then Westminster figures. Currently it stands at 35%. The entry of new political actors, women, many of whom had not served in electoral politics before, has diversified the social composition of the new legislature by improving the descriptive representation of women, as well as decoupling the association of men and certain sorts of masculinities with political entitlement. Women currently lead two of the four main political parties and comprise, since a couple of weeks ago, and you might argue by sleight of hand, but I wouldn't, 40% of the cabinet. There's also evidence of some new regendered paths and outcomes. So as well as the normalisation of women politicians, we see the reframing of classic women's issues such as domestic violence and childcare as mainstream issues of political priority. We've seen the introduction of feminist perspectives to areas not traditionally viewed as gendered, such as transport and economic development. And the championing of equality's mainstreaming and gender budgeting, particularly by Fiona Mackay and Angela O'Hagan as activist academics. The style of policy making is also more inclusive and consultative than its Westminster counterpart, including the participation of women's organisations. So we see new paths, new developments, and in those some of the original demands and design aspirations of critical actors. That this new institution would provide principles, provisions and practices that were more responsive to women's concerns and more likely to tackle structural discrimination. However, on the other hand, these new elements have not displaced the old, but interact with them and coexist with them, such that the underlying norms of the Parliament are politics as usual. These include tendencies towards political centralisation, strong party discipline, and executive dominance of the legislature. So the Westminster model was presented as discredited during devolution debates. However, subsequently we see evidence that, nested as it is as a higher order institution and as a legacy, it exerts a powerful drag on new institutional paths and it limits reform. So I think the evidence shows us that the old has come back in a number of ways. First, in formal ways, for example, filling gaps in the detail of institutional blueprints. So the Westminster model provided the default position for standing orders and procedures in all instances where reformers didn't specifically advocate different ideas. Second, the old has provided a repertoire, if you like, of techniques for tackling problems. Institutional actors fall back on the old, even though the architects of devolution set up the Parliament in distinction to Westminster. And in turn, these shape the capacity of women and men to act in collaborative ways or to promote new politics. We see evidence for this too in the overlapping institutions of political recruitment. And Merrill Kenny's detailed work demonstrates that there's been a drift back to old models of candidate recruitment as a selection of favoured sons. So within a few short years, commentators had adjudged that new politics had been defeated and had been replaced by politics as usual. Indeed, new politics, I think, has largely disappeared from the political lexicon. I mean, ask yourself, when was the last time you heard anybody talk about new politics? So we have a case of the remembering of the old and the forgetting of the new. Turning now to the United Nations, where I've just finished fieldwork and I'm just starting analysis. So these are really very impressionistic findings and not for sharing. Dubbed by some commentators, as I said, as the super agency for women's rights, UN Women was created in 2010 by means of a resolution of the United Nations General Assembly. And it's the latest institutional creation of the UN system to try and address its commitments to gender equality, some of which date back to the 1940s. It's got a very ambitious mandate incorporating, incorporating normative work and country-level programming. It's got strategic priority areas of violence against women, women, peace and security, leadership and participation, economic empowerment, human rights and Millennium Development Goals, so it doesn't have very much to do. It's also charged with holding the rest of the UN system to account on gender equality, including monitoring system-wide progress. So first, as with the Scottish case, we see the importance of women's organisations and feminist insiders as critical actors at the advocacy stage. In particular, global women's rights activists, later working together as the GEAR Coalition, played pivotal roles in aligning gender reform demands to other reform paths, in particular the UN's reform programme for system-wide coherence. And they kept the issue on the table over more than 5 years of protracted discussions, member state infighting and foot dragging. They had influence at the design stage, successfully lobbying for the creation of a higher status entity with high-level leadership in the form of an Under-Secretary General. This is a crucial design requirement in a highly hierarchical system. It thus countered the effects of marginal status and lack of authority that had had such an impact on the capacity of previous entities such as UNIFEM and the Division for the Advancement of Women. They advocated also for the strengthened mandate for UN Women to coordinate across the system, and this addressed the problem of system-wide coherence, particularly the failings to date around gender mainstreaming. But they were less successful in their demands for the presence of civil society organisations on the entity's governing board, which would have been a very important plank of accountability, and for guarantees of ambitious and predictable funding for the new entity. And after all, ostensible reform efforts can be a means of perpetuating the status quo if sufficient resources are not allocated. Discuss. They also experienced greater barriers in the Scottish case, particularly once the process of formal negotiations amongst member states was underway. So whilst all institutional design must be understood primarily as political rather than technical, this is particularly so in the case of the UN, where negotiations are consensus-based, which tends towards outcomes around the lowest common denominator. So while some institutional architects had radical visions of transformatory possibilities, many of these elements were diluted or fudged in the long and difficult process of member state negotiations and UN realpolitik. So as you said, all institutional blueprints are ambiguous, but the blueprint of UN Women is particularly ambiguous. Perhaps surprisingly, it's ambiguous as to its relationship with what's sometimes called the Women's Human Rights Treaty, CEDAW. It's ambiguous what its relationship is to UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which contains within it one of the most important mandates around women, peace and security. And I think it can be argued that these legacies of ambiguity could put UN Women on an institutional path of political timidity and compromised authority. At the very least, it points to the continued uncertainty and ongoing contestation as various actors, UN Women, the UN system, member states and civil society organisations, interpret those ambiguous rules in more or less progressive ways. So looking at how new and old have played out in the post-design phase or early days of UN Women. UN Women has forced me to rethink of a kind of simple forgetting the new, remembering the old. It poses some puzzles because in the early stories at play, UN Women was presented as if it was a blank slate, a brand new institution, as if it had sprung fully formed from the founding resolution. And this is despite the underlying continuities of mandate. The founding resolution simply states that the new entity shall take on all the old mandates. There are also underlying continuities of staff. The majority of staff are in fact from the old entities, although there have been several layers of new management and a growing number of new recruits as part of its expansion. So in fact, in seeming contrast to the Scottish case, UN Women, for a time at least, appeared to have forgotten the old altogether. So in the first few years of the institution, this year zero approach meant that there were very few incentives to undertake stock-taking exercises or to view the legacy organisations as resources. So as well as distancing the new organisation from very real weaknesses and failures, what it also did was closed off potential opportunities to take advantage of continuities or to capitalise on gender equality expertise. At times it's taken prompts from external partners to recognise the value of the old. So in one case, UN Women was publicly criticised for throwing away the family treasures as a result of initially neglecting its actually innovative work on gender responsive budgeting, which had a 20-year track record with the old UNIFEM. But I must emphasise there has been a rolling back from this position and actually lots of evidence of learning and adapting. Okay, how might we explain the propensity of institutional actors to fall back on the old, or more particularly the old of the dominant mainstream? So as I say, the institutional design literature points to the permissive stage of institutional design as the moment in which the new can be embedded. However, conditions of uncertainty and incomplete information characterise most real-world contexts. And this gives rise to a strong impetus, I think, for actors to fall back on what they know. And that's why we see the seemingly contradictory interplay of new and old in both the design and the post-design phase. Novelty has both positive and negative faces. The novelty of the new, fresh, untried, breaking the mould, that make them attractive to reformers may make such newness suspect once we're at the stage of institutionalisation. They seem risky, they seem unrealistic. And borrowing from sociological institutionalism, I suggest that Arthur Stinchcomb's classic concept of the liability of newness can be adapted to explain why these processes occur. So the liability of newness relates to the vulnerability of new institutions as they face multiple challenges that relate to their newness and their need to struggle to survive. I argue that over and above then resistance, over and above a kind of falling back on the familiar, that the institutional quest for legitimacy, in order to mitigate the liability of newness and increase the chances of survival, provide an important part of the puzzle. So faced with the liability of newness, institutional actors need to seek legitimacy by both means of norms of appropriateness internally, but also by seeking endorsement from power holders in the wider environment. How do they go about this? Well, on the one hand, they could convince stakeholders of the merits of moving beyond the status quo by enacting new rules and new norms. Indeed, many reform efforts, particularly gender reform efforts, are actually motivated by a desire to challenge the gendered status quo, to change, if you like, the rules of the game. However, such approaches are risky, especially when they're at odds with the wider environment. And I think in seeking external credibility and legitimacy, we can see that actors in new institutions, both the Scottish Parliament and the United Nations, UN Women, are likely to fall back on authoritative modes, firmly anchored, recognisably so. So old rules and practices that comprise the Westminster model and the UN system model serve as a powerful shorthand of legitimacy and credibility. In adopting or allowing to creep back in old rules, both formal and informal, in addition to, as well as sometimes instead of new rules, political actors seek to demonstrate that the new institutions are in authority. I contend that the liability of newness is also gendered. Tacit knowledge about what is valued, credible, authoritative, strategic remain coded masculine and are widely shared among horizontal and vertical networks of power holders. So actors therefore draw upon gendered conceptions of both liability and legitimacy with gendered consequences. So this reinscribes particular gender norms and relations as authoritative ways to do politics or do bureaucracy is understood to be done. It blunts reformist potential and closes down new paths. Sometimes also rendering specific gender reforms as marginal, as a luxury when we have to think about the bigger picture of survival and demonstration of inauthority. So where does that leave us? I think what it does is it shows us that it's important to understand the factors that constrain and blunt the reformist potential of new institutions in order to be realistic about the promises and limitations of gender change. So implementing change is difficult, it's messy, it's prolonged. In addition to powerful legacies of the past, unintended design decisions and the influence of wider institutional norms and contexts, new institutions must also struggle with the liability of newness. And it seems to me that gender reforms are particularly thinly institutionalised because the gender status quo in its daily reproduction is so sticky and hard to dislodge on so many fronts. So I think if we understand institutional change as nested and that nestedness is gendered, we can keep our expectations in check and measure the achievements of reform efforts in the context of the unequal odds against which they are achieved, and to celebrate, if you like, what Eben calls small wins and Duncanson calls small acts. So I think that what this does is it shows the necessity for looking at change over the long haul. It shows the necessity to have a presence both inside institutions and as actors outside institutions, monitoring, advocating, demanding that new institutions remember their new rules. What I want to do now is I want to end with an image by the feminist Welsh painter Mary Lloyd-Jones. Now, I've got the good fortune to own this print, and we used it on the cover of a book which I wrote with Paul Cheney and Laura McAllister on women and devolution in Wales. And I haven't had time to talk about that, comparative work on Wales and Northern Ireland. You'd never get a drink if I started. But there are many resonances. But for me, it evokes a key theme of my talk tonight. Change is about contestation and struggle. There's a need for ongoing pressure from external activists and critical friends, and ongoing work by tempered radicals on the inside to continue to contest the rules and pursue a gender agenda. So this is dedicated to the feminist and other change agents who have had the privilege to work with and to study over the last 2 decades. Dal dy dir, stand your ground, celebrate the small wins, keep present, remain vigilant, stand your ground. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Fiona. When I opened the lecture, I said how you had helped to create the Feminism and Institutionalism International Network, amongst other things, to promote dialogue between feminist scholarship and the mainstream. I think it's striking how many political scientists in what you call the mainstream have engaged with your arguments about feminism and institutionalism and have refracted them into their own work. And I think we know why after this lecture, which was a brilliant connection of personal experiences of family and career, of scholarly arguments about the hidden gendered dimensions of political institutions, and how it's not enough simply to reveal those dimensions once, but to remain alert to their potential to go back into hiding. And then connected also to practical implications of those arguments for the Scottish Parliament and the United Nations. I thought it was a brilliant lecture. What really struck me though, was apart from this being a packed house, it was a tremendously smiley house. So many people walked in tonight with great big beaming smiles all over their faces. Those who had passing reference in the lecture responded with a big smile about their part in your rise. And again, everybody's at it again. I think people are taking real joy in your achievements and in their deserved recognition through this inaugural lecture. Congratulations.